My name is Rebecca, and at 63, I thought I understood what heartbreak felt like. I was wrong. It happened on a Tuesday morning while I was watering my roses, the same roses I'd planted when Marcus was born, 38 years ago. Each bloom reminded me of a milestone, his first steps, first day of school, graduation. I'd been so proud watching him grow into the successful lawyer he'd become. The phone rang as I adjusted the sprinkler. Marcus's name lit up the screen, and my heart did that little flutter it always did when my son called. We hadn't talked in 3 weeks. He was busy with his practice, his new wife, their perfect life in the suburbs. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, setting down my gardening gloves. "I was just thinking about you." There was a pause, not the comfortable kind, but the sharp, cutting silence that comes before life changes forever. "Rebecca," he said, "not Mom, not Ma." My first name, spoken like I was a client he didn't particularly want to represent. "I need to tell you something. Sarah and I have been talking, and we think it's best if you stop coming to family events. You make everyone uncomfortable with your stories, your constant need for attention." The words hit me like cold water. I stood there, holding the phone, watching water from my hose create small puddles around my feet. "I don't understand," I whispered. "What stories? What attention?" "You know what I mean. Last Christmas, going on about Dad's war medals, at Sarah's birthday, talking about your volunteer work at the shelter. It's embarrassing, Rebecca. We're trying to build something sophisticated here, and you don't fit." I thought about last Christmas. I'd shared one story about Marcus's father, my late husband, because Sarah had asked about the medal display. One story about the man who'd loved Marcus more than life itself, who'd worked 2 jobs to pay for his law school. "Marcus," I said carefully, "those aren't stories for attention. They're our family history. They're where you came from." "Well, where I came from isn't where I'm going." His voice was cold, businesslike. "Sarah and I think it's better if we maintain some distance. We'll call when it's convenient." When it's convenient. 38 years of motherhood reduced to their convenience. I hung up without saying goodbye. Not because I was angry, but because I couldn't trust my voice not to break. I stood in my garden, surrounded by roses that had witnessed every moment of raising that boy, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart. That was still beating. Something deeper. My understanding of who I was in this world. The worst part wasn't his words. It was the rehearsed quality of them, the way he'd clearly practiced this speech with Sarah. They'd discussed me like I was a problem to be managed, an embarrassment to be hidden away. I thought about calling his sister Elena, but stopped myself. If Marcus felt this way, what did Elena think? How long had my children been uncomfortable with me, tolerating me out of duty rather than love? That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. The house felt enormous around me, every room echoing with memories of children who no longer wanted me in their lives. I looked at the photos covering my refrigerator, graduation pictures, wedding photos, grandchildren I saw twice a year if I was lucky. And I realized something profound. I'd spent 38 years being Marcus's mother, 25 years being Elena's mother, and somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten how to be Rebecca, the woman who'd volunteered at the homeless shelter every Saturday for 15 years, the woman who'd kept a garden that neighbors stopped to admire, the woman who could tell stories about love and sacrifice because she'd lived them. Maybe Marcus was right about one thing. I didn't fit in his sophisticated world. But as I sat there in the quiet of my own home, I began to wonder, why had I been trying so hard to squeeze myself into a space where I wasn't wanted? If you're watching this and you've felt invisible in your own family, please know you're not alone. Hit that subscribe button. We're building a community of women who understand what it means to find ourselves again. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I'd love to know. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about the phone call that changed everything. About the moment I realized that love shouldn't feel like apologizing for who you are. The weeks that followed Marcus's call taught me the difference between being alone and being lonely. I'd been alone since Robert died 5 years ago, but I'd never been lonely. Not with my children calling, visiting, including me in their lives. Now I understood what true isolation felt like. Elena called 3 days later. I should have known it wasn't coincidence. "Hi, Mom," she said. But even those 2 words carried a distance that hadn't been there before. "I heard you and Marcus had a conversation. As if my son's dismissal of me had been a casual chat between equals. "He told you what he said?" I asked, settling into Robert's old armchair, the one I'd kept because it still smelled faintly of his aftershave. "He's concerned about you, Mom. We both are. You've been clingy lately, calling too much, showing up at events and making them about yourself." Clingy. I tried to remember the last time I'd called Elena. It had been 2 weeks ago on a Sunday evening, just to hear her voice. I'd talked for maybe 10 minutes about the community garden project, asking if she thought her daughter might like to help plant sunflowers. "When have I made events about myself?" I asked quietly. "At Marcus's promotion dinner last month. You kept talking about when he was little, how proud Dad would have been. Sarah was trying to talk about their new house and you kept interrupting with stories." I remembered that dinner differently. Sarah had been discussing their home renovations, a 40-minute monologue about Italian marble and imported fixtures, and when there was finally a pause, I'd mentioned how proud Robert would have been of Marcus's success. One comment, maybe 2 sentences. But Elena was continuing, her voice taking on the patient tone people use with difficult elderly relatives. "And you show up everywhere. Marcus's office party, my book club meeting, the kids' school events. It's like you're afraid we'll forget about you if you're not constantly there." Each accusation felt like a small paper cut. I thought about Marcus's office party. I'd been invited. His secretary had called specifically to invite me, saying Marcus wanted his mother there. Elena's book club had been my idea in the first place. I'd introduced her to half the women who attended. The school events were for my grandchildren, who used to run to me with excitement, who used to beg me to stay longer. "I thought you wanted me there," I said, hating how small my voice sounded. "We do, Mom, sometimes, but you need to learn boundaries. You need to understand that we have our own lives now, our own priorities. You can't expect to be the center of everything anymore. The center of everything." When had I ever been that? When had wanting to be part of my children's lives become a character flaw? After Elena hung up, promising to call soon, which we both knew meant when it was convenient for her, I sat in Robert's chair and tried to understand when I'd become the villain in my own family story. I thought about the woman I used to be. Before Robert's death, I'd been busy with my own interests, my garden club presidency, my volunteer work, my book discussions with the library group. I'd had dinner parties, weekend trips with friends, a life that existed independently of my children's activities. But after Robert died, the quiet had been so overwhelming. The house had felt like a mausoleum, and my children's lives had become my lifeline. When Marcus called to invite me somewhere, I said yes immediately. When Elena mentioned an event, I cleared my schedule. I'd thought I was being a good mother, available and supportive. Now I realized I'd been something else entirely. Desperate. The next few weeks passed in a fog of careful distance. I didn't call either of my children, waiting instead for them to reach out to me. The silence stretched on, confirming what I'd begun to suspect. They were relieved by my absence. My refrigerator, once covered with photos and grandchildren's artwork, began to feel like a museum of relationships that no longer existed in any meaningful way. Every image reminded me of moments when I'd thought I was creating memories, when I'd actually been imposing my presence on people who'd grown tired of accommodating me. The hardest part was the grandchildren. 8-year-old Lily had called me every Sunday for 2 years, chattering about school and friends and whatever book she was reading. Now those calls stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to call Elena and ask about it, she said gently, "Mom, we think it's better if the kids have some space too. They need to learn independence." Independence. At 8 and 10 years old, my grandchildren needed independence from their grandmother's love. I began to see myself through my children's eyes. An aging woman clinging to relationships that had naturally evolved beyond her need for central placement. A mother who hadn't learned to step back, who'd interpreted invitations as obligations and presents as requirement. The woman at the grocery store, a place I'd once shopped with purpose for family dinners and holiday gatherings, asked where I'd been. "Haven't seen you buying your usual big hauls," she said with friendly concern. "Everything okay?" I realized I'd been cooking for one for weeks now, buying single portions of everything, small containers of milk that wouldn't spoil before I could finish them. My cart looked like the purchases of someone who'd given up on the idea that food was meant to be shared. "Just adjusting to a quieter life," I told her, which was the truth, even if it wasn't the whole truth. At home, I tried to fill the silence with activities. I reorganized closets, deep-cleaned rooms that were already immaculate, tended my garden with obsessive attention, but every task felt hollow, performed for an audience of one who was beginning to question her own worth. The house phone rang less frequently. My social calendar, once dotted with children's events and family gatherings, stretched ahead like an empty highway. I'd built my life around being needed, and now I was discovering what remained when that need disappeared. But in the quiet moments, watering my roses, reading in Robert's chair, watching the sunset from my kitchen window, I began to sense something else stirring. Not sadness exactly, not even loneliness anymore. Something harder to name, but more solid. Something that whispered that maybe, just maybe, this forced solitude was offering me a gift I hadn't known I needed. A chance to remember who Rebecca had been before she became just Marcus and Elena's mother. I tried one more time. God forgive me. I tried to be the mother they seemed to want, invisible when inconvenient, present when summoned. The call came on a Thursday. Sarah's voice was honey-sweet with the particular kind of kindness that people use when they need something from someone they've already dismissed. "Rebecca? Hi, it's Sarah. I hope I'm not bothering you." Of course she wasn't bothering me. What else did I have to do these days? "Marcus and I are in a bit of a bind," she continued. "We have that charity gala tomorrow night, the one for the children's hospital. Our babysitter canceled last minute, and we were wondering if you might be available to watch the kids." My heart leaped before my brain could catch up. They needed me. After weeks of silence, they were reaching out. "Of course," I said quickly. "I'd love to spend time with Emma and David. What time should I—" "Oh, wonderful. Could you be here by 6? The kids will already have eaten, and they should be in bed by 8:30. We'll probably be quite late. These things tend to run long." No mention of dinner for me. No invitation to stay afterward and hear about their evening. Just show up, provide the service, disappear when no longer needed. But I was so hungry for contact with my family that I pushed aside the small voice pointing out how this felt. Friday evening, I arrived at Marcus and Sarah's pristine suburban home with a bag full of books and puzzles, hoping to make the evening special for Emma and David. I'd even stopped at the bakery to pick up their favorite cookies, the ones with rainbow sprinkles that Sarah usually prohibited because they were too sugary. Emma, now 9, greeted me politely but distantly. "Hi, Grandma Rebecca." Not just Grandma anymore, the formal distance that even a child had learned to maintain. "Mom and Dad said you'd put us to bed," David added, his 10-year-old voice carrying a matter-of-fact acceptance that hurt more than outright rejection. "We're supposed to stay in our rooms after 8:30. I looked around the living room I'd helped decorate when they'd first moved in. The family photos that had once included me prominently now featured mostly Marcus, Sarah, and the children. I appeared in only one picture, tucked into the corner of a group shot from last Christmas, partially obscured by Sarah's mother, who'd flown in from California for the holidays. "How was school this week?" I asked, settling onto the couch that used to be my spot when I visited regularly. "Fine," Emma said, not looking up from her tablet. "We learned about fractions in math," David offered. But when I tried to engage him further, asking if he needed help with homework, he shook his head. "Dad says I should be more independent." More independence. The word that had become a wall between me and my own grandchildren. I tried reading them stories, but Emma preferred her screen time, and David had already finished his book for the week. When I suggested we bake something together, they looked at me with genuine confusion. "Mom doesn't let us bake," Emma said. "It makes too much mess. And besides," David added with the unconscious cruelty that children possess, "you probably don't know how to make the things we like anyway." I sat there, surrounded by children who barely knew me anymore, in a house that had been designed to accommodate everyone except the woman who'd helped raise their father. The cookies I'd brought sat untouched on the counter. The books I'd carefully chosen remained in my bag. At 8:30 sharp, both children announced they were going to bed without any prompting. They brushed their teeth, put on pajamas, and disappeared into their rooms with mechanical efficiency. No requests for extra stories, no delays or negotiations. They'd been trained to expect nothing from their evening with Grandma Rebecca. I sat alone in their living room for 4 hours, waiting for Marcus and Sarah to return. I couldn't leave. I was responsible for the children, but I had nothing to do. Their television was locked with parental controls I didn't know the code for. Their bookshelves contained only design magazines and business journals. I ended up sitting in silence, looking at family photos that increasingly excluded me, feeling like an intruder in what had once felt like a second home. When Marcus and Sarah finally returned at nearly 1 in the morning, they were laughing about something that had happened at the gala. They stopped mid-conversation when they saw me sitting in their darkened living room. "Oh," Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of surprise, as if she'd forgotten I was there. "How did everything go? Any problems?" "No problems," I said, gathering my purse and the untouched bag of activities. "The children were perfect angels." "Great," Marcus said, already looking at his phone, scrolling through messages he'd missed during the evening. "Thanks for helping out." That was it. No inquiry about my evening. No interest in whether I'd enjoyed spending time with my grandchildren. No invitation to hear about their charitable event. I was a service provider who'd performed adequately and could now be dismissed. I drove home through empty suburban streets, past houses where families were sleeping peacefully together, and realized that I'd just experienced the most profound loneliness of my life. Not because I'd been alone, but because I'd been treated as invisible while surrounded by people who were supposed to love me. The worst part was the children. Emma and David had been taught, without anyone saying it directly, that their grandmother was a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent source of love and support. They'd learned to interact with me politely but distantly, the way they'd been trained to behave with strangers. When had I become a stranger to my own grandchildren? When had my presence in their lives been reduced to emergency babysitting and obligation visits? That night, lying in my empty house, I stared at the ceiling and finally admitted to myself what I'd been avoiding. My children didn't want me in their lives. They tolerated me when necessary, utilized me when convenient, but they'd moved beyond needing or wanting my love. And the most devastating realization of all was that they seemed happier without me. For the first time in weeks, I didn't cry. The tears had been for the relationship I thought we'd had. Now I was mourning something deeper, my understanding of my own worth in this world. If the people I'd loved most didn't value my presence, what did that say about who I'd become? But as I lay there in the darkness, something else began to surface. A small, quiet voice that whispered, "Maybe their happiness without me says more about them than it does about you." It was the first time in months that I'd questioned their narrative instead of accepting it as truth. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by regular mail in Sarah's careful handwriting. "You're invited to celebrate David's 11th birthday," it announced in cheerful blue lettering, complete with cartoon balloons and party hats. I held it for a long time, this formal invitation to my own grandson's birthday party, as if I were a neighbor who might or might not attend, rather than the grandmother who'd been present for every birthday of his life until now. The party was scheduled for Saturday at 2 o'clock. "Light refreshments will be served," the invitation noted, and at the bottom, in smaller print, "Gifts are appreciated, but not expected, not expected," from his grandmother, as if my presence alone wasn't contribution enough, and my absence wouldn't be particularly missed either. I set the invitation on my kitchen counter and stared at it for 3 days. Each morning, I'd make my coffee and look at those cheerful balloons, trying to decide what this piece of cardboard represented. Was it an olive branch, a test, or simply an obligation they felt bound to fulfill? On Friday night, I made my decision. I wouldn't go. The realization surprised me with its clarity. For the first time in months, I wasn't agonizing over how to make myself more palatable to my family. I wasn't wondering what I should wear, what gift would strike the right balance between generous and appropriate, what stories I should avoid telling, what version of myself I should present. I simply didn't want to spend my Saturday being tolerated. Saturday afternoon, while David's party was presumably underway, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took myself on a date. I drove to the botanical garden across town, bought myself an overpriced latte, and spent 2 hours walking among flowers that existed purely for their own beauty, without needing to justify their presence to anyone. I sat on a bench near the rose garden and watched other families pass by, grandparents pushing strollers, teenagers reluctantly accompanying their parents, elderly couples walking slowly hand in hand. Normal family dynamics that didn't require careful navigation or constant self-editing. My phone buzzed once around 3:30. A text from Elena. "Where are you?" David keeps asking about Grandma. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling something I'd never experienced before in relation to my children: indifference. Not anger, not hurt, just a profound lack of energy for the drama they'd created around my presence. I typed back, "I hope he has a wonderful day." Then I turned off my phone. That evening, when Marcus called, I didn't answer. The voicemail he left was a masterpiece of passive aggression disguised as concern. "Mom, we were disappointed you missed David's party. He was really looking forward to seeing you. I don't understand why you'd just not show up without calling. That's not like you. Sarah went out of her way to include you, and frankly, it was embarrassing having to make excuses for your absence. Please call me back so we can figure out what's going on." "What's going on," I thought as I deleted the message without calling back, "is that I finally heard what you've been telling me for months. You don't want me there." So I wasn't there. The phone calls continued for several days. Elena left increasingly frustrated messages, starting with gentle concern and escalating to barely concealed irritation. "Mom, this is ridiculous. You're acting like a child. David is asking why Grandma doesn't love him anymore. How am I supposed to explain that?" But I'd moved beyond explanations. Each passing day of silence felt like shedding a heavy coat I'd been wearing for months. The constant anxiety about whether I was welcome, whether I was saying the right things, whether I was taking up too much space in conversations, all of it simply evaporated. I began to rediscover my house, really see it, for the first time since Robert died. The living room had beautiful morning light that I'd never noticed, because I'd been too busy keeping it perfect for potential visits from children who came only out of duty. The kitchen had space for projects I'd abandoned because I was always cooking for others or keeping it available for family gatherings that never felt natural anymore. I pulled out my painting supplies from the closet where they'd been gathering dust for 5 years. Robert had set up a small studio for me in the spare bedroom, and I'd stopped using it after his death because it felt selfish to pursue hobbies when I should have been focusing on maintaining connections with my grieving children. Now I understood that my grief and their grief had been different things entirely. They'd lost their father and had each other for comfort. I'd lost my husband and my identity as half of a couple, and instead of dealing with that loss, I'd tried to rebuild myself as an essential part of their lives. The painting I started that week wasn't planned or considered. It emerged from some place inside me that had been waiting patiently for attention. Broad strokes of blue and gold, colors that had nothing to do with decorating my house for other people's approval, and everything to do with how autumn light looked through my kitchen window at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. For the first time in months, hours passed without me checking my phone. I didn't calculate time zones to figure out when it would be appropriate to call Elena in Portland. I didn't rehearse conversations or worry about whether I'd said something wrong in our last interaction. I was simply present in my own life. On Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after David's party, I made a decision that would have terrified the woman I'd been just days earlier. I drove to the grocery store and bought ingredients for a dinner party. Not for my children, who'd made it clear my hospitality wasn't particularly valued, but for myself and whoever might appreciate an invitation to share a meal with someone who was rediscovering the pleasure of cooking for people who actually wanted to be there. I called Margaret from my old book club, the one I'd stopped attending because it conflicted with being available for family obligations. "I'm having a few people over for dinner Saturday night," I told her. "Would you like to join us?" "Rebecca!" Her delight was immediate and genuine. "I haven't seen you in months. Of course I'd love to come. Who else will be there?" I realized I didn't have an answer to that question yet, but for the first time in recent memory, that felt like an exciting problem to solve rather than a source of anxiety. "I'm still figuring that out," I admitted, "but I'm cooking pot roast and making that chocolate cake I used to bring to book club meetings." "The one with the raspberry filling? Oh my goodness, yes. What can I bring?" As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. Not nervous energy about whether I'd say the right things or take up too much space, but genuine excitement about spending an evening with someone who wanted to be in my company. My children could keep their careful distance, their polite tolerance, their calculated interactions. I was done competing for space in lives that had grown too small to accommodate the fullness of who I'd always been. But they didn't know what I had kept all along, the woman I'd been before. I forgot that love shouldn't require me to disappear. The dinner party happened on a crisp October evening that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this house 27 years ago. The dining room I'd barely used since Robert's death came alive with conversation, laughter, and the kind of easy warmth that happens when people genuinely want to be together. Margaret brought her sister Joan, who'd recently moved back to town after her divorce. Carol from the garden club came with homemade dinner rolls and stories about her latest volunteer work with literacy programs. Susan, my neighbor who'd been quietly checking on me for months, arrived with flowers from her own garden and a bottle of wine that we opened immediately. As we sat around my table, the one I'd polished countless times for family gatherings where I'd felt like a guest in my own home, I realized I was laughing, really laughing, not the careful, measured responses I'd perfected for my children's visits. "Rebecca, this pot roast is incredible," Joan said, reaching for seconds without hesitation. "You'll have to share the recipe." "My grandmother's," I told her. "She used to say the secret was cooking it low and slow, but I think the real secret was that she put love into everything she made. Like this chocolate cake," Carol added, savoring another bite. "This is the kind of dessert that makes you understand why people used to gather around family tables every Sunday." Family tables. The phrase might have stung a month ago, but sitting here with women who'd chosen to spend their evening with me, it felt like a gift. This was what gathering should feel like. Easy, natural, appreciated. "I haven't entertained in so long," I admitted. "I'd forgotten how much I enjoy it." "Well, we haven't forgotten how much we enjoy your company," Margaret said firmly. "You disappeared on us for a while there. We missed you. They missed me. Not my usefulness or my availability for their convenience, but my actual presence in their lives." The concept felt revolutionary after months of feeling like an inconvenience to the people who were supposed to love me most. After everyone left, I sat in my kitchen with the last glass of wine, surrounded by dishes that would wait until morning, and the lingering warmth of genuine connection. The house felt different, not empty, but peaceful, full of good memories instead of echoing with rejection. I walked through rooms I'd been seeing through other people's eyes for too long. The living room with its comfortable furniture that Marcus had always criticized as dated. The hallway lined with photos of trips Robert and I had taken, adventures my children had always seemed impatient to hear about. The study where I'd kept my books, my correspondence with old friends, the parts of myself that didn't center around being someone's mother or grandmother. In Robert's desk, my desk now, I reminded myself, I found the letter I'd been avoiding for 3 years, the one from the Peace Corps, inviting me to apply for their senior volunteer program. Experienced educators and professionals over 50 were needed for literacy programs in Costa Rica. The application deadline had passed months ago, but seeing it again sparked something I'd thought was dead. I'd been a teacher for 32 years before I retired to care for Robert during his illness. I'd loved that work, loved seeing students discover their own capabilities, loved the daily challenge of making learning accessible and exciting. After Robert died, my children had discouraged me from pursuing any volunteer work that would take me away from being available to them. "You need to focus on yourself, Mom," Elena had said when I'd mentioned possibly tutoring at the community center. "Don't take on too much responsibility right now." But what if taking on responsibility was exactly what I needed? What if being useful to people who valued my contributions was how I'd heal, rather than sitting in my empty house waiting for phone calls that never came? I pulled out my laptop and began researching. There were literacy programs in my own city that needed volunteers, environmental groups looking for people with teaching experience to develop educational materials, a senior mentorship program that matched older adults with young people aging out of foster care. For the first time in months, I felt excited about the future instead of trapped by it. The next morning, I called the literacy center downtown. The woman who answered, Ms. Patricia Williams, sounded genuinely delighted by my inquiry. "We're always looking for qualified tutors," she said warmly. "With your teaching background, you'd be perfect for our adult education program. Many of our students are people who didn't get the chance to finish their education when they were younger. They're incredibly motivated, and they need patient, experienced instructors who understand that learning doesn't end at 18. Students who wanted to be there, who appreciated the opportunity to learn, who saw my experience as an asset rather than something to be tolerated or managed." I scheduled an interview for the following week. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since before Robert died. I drove to the nursery and bought bulbs, not for a garden that needed to impress visitors, but for the simple pleasure of knowing that come spring, there would be crocuses and daffodils pushing through the soil regardless of who was there to see them bloom. As I knelt in my backyard, my hands deep in the rich earth that had been waiting patiently for my attention, I thought about the woman I'd been before grief and loneliness had convinced me that my worth depended entirely on how much my children needed me. I'd been someone who planned gardens for beauty that would emerge long after the planting was finished, Someone who believed in delayed gratification and the satisfaction of work that served a larger purpose. Someone who understood that growth happened slowly, beneath the surface, in ways that weren't always immediately visible. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Mom, Marcus and I are worried about you. You haven't been returning calls. Can we schedule a time to talk this week?" A time to talk. As if my availability needed to be scheduled now that I'd stopped dropping everything to accommodate their convenience. I looked at the message for a long moment, my hands still covered with soil, surrounded by the evidence of my investment in a future they knew nothing about. 6 months ago, that text would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I would have called back immediately, apologizing for my absence, eager to reassure them that I wasn't going anywhere, that I would always be available whenever they decided they had time for me. Now I felt something entirely different. Calm. I typed back, "I'm fine. Busy with some new projects. I'll call when I'm free." Then I turned off my phone and went back to my bulbs. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. The kind that comes when you stop trying to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold you comfortably. When you remember that your value isn't determined by how much other people need you, but by how much you have to offer to those who can recognize it. For too many months, I'd been measuring myself by my children's diminishing interest in my presence. Now, I was beginning to understand that their capacity to appreciate me said more about the limitations of their vision than about my worth as a person. I was still their mother. I would always love them. But I was also Rebecca, a woman with interests, capabilities, and contributions that extended far beyond the role they'd assigned me in their carefully curated lives. The soil was rich and dark between my fingers, full of potential that would manifest in its own time, according to its own natural rhythms. Like me, it had been waiting for the right moment to bloom again. And spring, I realized with a satisfaction that came from somewhere deep in my chest, was going to be magnificent. The call came on a Wednesday morning in November, 3 weeks after I'd started my volunteer work at the Literacy Center. I was reviewing lesson plans for my adult students when the phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Rebecca Morrison?" The voice was professional, courteous. "This is Jennifer Walsh from Peterson & Associates. We're the law firm handling your late husband's estate matters." I set down my coffee cup carefully. Robert's estate had been settled years ago, or so I'd thought. "I'm sorry, but I think there might be some confusion. My husband's affairs were handled by our family attorney when he passed." "Yes, ma'am, that's correct for the primary estate. However, we've been managing a separate trust that Mr. Morrison established in 2018. According to the terms he set, we were instructed to contact you 5 years after his death if certain conditions were met." 5 years. It had been exactly 5 years and 2 months since Robert died. "What kind of trust?" I asked, though something deep in my chest already knew this conversation was going to change everything. I'd prefer to discuss the details in person, if possible. Mr. Morrison was very specific about how this information should be communicated. "Would you be available to come to our office this week?" I found myself agreeing to meet Friday afternoon, my mind spinning with questions Robert had apparently anticipated I would ask. He'd always been a planner, always thinking 3 steps ahead, but a secret trust? Established 3 years before his death. Time to activate now? The next 2 days passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. I went through my routines, teaching at the Literacy Center, tending my garden, preparing for the book club meeting I was hosting next week. But underneath everything ran an electric current of anticipation. Thursday evening, Elena called. For the first time in weeks, I answered immediately. "Mom, finally. We've been trying to reach you for days. Marcus and I want to take you to dinner this weekend. We think we need to clear the air about everything that's been happening." Clear the air, as if the problem was a simple misunderstanding rather than months of being made to feel unwelcome in my own family. "This weekend is busy for me," I said, surprising both of us with how natural the refusal sounded. "Maybe next week." "Busy? Mom, what could you possibly—" Elena caught herself, but not quickly enough. The implication hung between us. What could someone like me, someone whose children had made clear was no longer central to any important events, possibly have to do? "I have a commitment Friday afternoon, book club Saturday evening, and Sunday, I'm helping one of my students prepare for her GED exam." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Students?" Elena finally asked. "What students?" "I'm tutoring adults at the Literacy Center downtown. It's incredibly rewarding work. These people are so determined to better their lives, to gain the education they missed when they were younger. Yesterday, my student Maria finally read her first complete chapter book. She cried when she finished it. "You're working again?" "Volunteering. But yes, I'm teaching again. It reminds me how much I loved it, how good I was at it." Another pause. I could almost hear Elena recalibrating, trying to fit this information into her narrative of her mother as someone who needed to be managed rather than someone who was capable of managing her own life quite well. "Well, that's good, Mom, I guess. But we really do need to talk. Things have been strange between us, and Sarah thinks..." "Sarah thinks what?" The question came out sharper than I'd intended, but I was suddenly tired of hearing about what Sarah thought regarding my relationship with my own children. "She thinks maybe you're going through some kind of delayed grief reaction, pulling away from family, making impulsive decisions. She knows a therapist who specializes in..." I hung up, not angrily, not dramatically. I simply pressed the red button and continued preparing my lesson plans for the next day. The old Rebecca would have called back immediately, apologizing for the disconnection, eager to smooth things over. This Rebecca had learned that some conversations weren't worth having. My phone buzzed with texts for the rest of the evening. Elena, then Marcus, then Elena again. I read them all but didn't respond. They could wait until after my meeting with the lawyer, until I understood what Robert had been planning, until I had all the information I needed to make decisions about my future. Friday afternoon, I dressed carefully in the navy suit I'd worn to Robert's funeral. The one that made me feel like the professional woman I'd been before grief convinced me to shrink myself small enough to fit into other people's ideas of who I should become. Peterson and Associates occupied a quiet corner building in the historic district downtown, the kind of place that suggested discretion and long-term thinking. Jennifer Walsh met me in a conference room with windows overlooking the tree-lined street where I'd once brought Marcus and Elena to feed ducks at the fountain. She was younger than I'd expected, with kind eyes and the manner of someone who'd delivered both wonderful and terrible news to people sitting in the chair I now occupied. "Mrs. Morrison, thank you for coming. I want to start by saying that your husband spoke of you with tremendous love and respect when we worked together on this trust. Everything he did was designed to protect and provide for you." She opened a thick folder and withdrew documents that looked far more complex than anything Robert and I had ever discussed. "In 2018, Mr. Morrison came to our firm with a specific concern. He was worried about what would happen to you if his children, your stepchildren technically, though he always referred to them as your children too, if they didn't provide the emotional and practical support you deserved after his death." Stepchildren. I'd almost forgotten that Marcus and Elena weren't biologically mine. I'd raised them from ages 12 and 7 when Robert and I married, loved them as completely as any mother could. They'd called me Mom from the beginning, and I'd never thought of them as anything but my own children. "He was particularly concerned," Jennifer continued gently, "about comments he'd overheard regarding their feelings about your role in their lives as they became adults." The room seemed to grow very quiet around us. Robert had known. Somehow, 3 years before he died, he'd sensed what would happen to me. The trust he established contains several components. First, a substantial financial component that will provide you with complete independence. Second, a detailed letter he wrote specifically for this moment. And third, instructions for certain actions he wanted taken if his fears about your treatment proved justified. She slid a sealed envelope across the table. My name was written on it in Robert's familiar handwriting, along with the words, "For Rebecca, when she remembers who she was meant to be." I stared at the envelope, feeling something shift inside my chest like the first crack in ice at the end of a long winter. "Mrs. Morrison, your husband loved you enough to plan for a future where you might need to remember your own worth. He wanted you to know that someone saw your value, even if others failed to recognize it." Outside the window, the November light was beginning to fade, and somewhere across town, my children were probably discussing my strange behavior and planning interventions for problems that existed only in their limited understanding of who I'd always been. But here, holding Robert's letter, surrounded by legal documents that proved someone had loved me enough to protect my future even from beyond the grave, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not just clarity anymore, but power. The kind that comes from being truly seen and valued, the kind that changes everything about how you move through the world. I looked up at Jennifer Walsh and smiled. I think it's time I remembered. I read Robert's letter sitting in my car outside the law office, the November wind rattling the windows as his words unraveled everything I thought I knew about my family. My dearest Rebecca, it began. If you're reading this, it means 5 years have passed since my death, and I fear my concerns about Marcus and Elena have proven justified. I hope I'm wrong, but I've prepared for the possibility that I'm not. I want you to know that I watched them these last few years, really watched them, and I saw things that broke my heart. The way they spoke about you when they thought I wasn't listening, the casual dismissal of your intelligence, your contributions, your feelings. The assumption that once I was gone, you would naturally fade into the background of their lives. You are not their biological mother, though you've been more of a mother to them than their own ever was. But I've realized they've never truly seen you as family. You were Robert's wife, someone they tolerated because they loved me. Now that I'm gone, they feel free to show you exactly how little you've meant to them. The trust I've established will give you complete financial independence. The house is yours, free and clear. I quietly paid off the mortgage last year and transferred the deed to your name only. There's enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life, to travel, to pursue whatever dreams you set aside to care for me and my children. But more importantly, Rebecca, I need you to remember who you were when I fell in love with you. You were magnificent, strong, intelligent, passionate about teaching, about making a difference. You had opinions, dreams, a life that was entirely your own. Don't let their inability to see your worth convince you that you have none. You deserved better from them. You deserved gratitude, respect, love. If they couldn't give you that, it says everything about their character and nothing about your value. Live, my darling. Live fully and without apology. You've earned that right. All my love, Robert P.S. I've instructed Jennifer to contact Marcus and Elena if you choose to do so. They'll learn exactly how much they owe their comfortable lives to the woman they've dismissed. Sometimes people need to understand the cost of their cruelty. I sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes, reading the letter 3 times, feeling something massive shift inside my chest. Not just understanding, but complete clarity about what had happened to me and why. When I finally drove home, there were 2 cars in my driveway, Marcus's silver BMW and Elena's white SUV. They were waiting on my front porch, looking like children called to the principal's office, unsure whether they were in trouble or I was. I walked up my own front path, my path, to my house, that I owned completely, and looked at these 2 adults who'd spent months making me feel small in my own life. "We need to talk, Mom," Marcus said, standing as I approached. "Elena told me about your phone call yesterday. This behavior isn't like you." "You're right," I said, unlocking my front door. "It's not like the me you're used to. Come inside." In my living room, in my house, that they had no claim to, I made a decision that would have terrified me 6 months ago. "I have something to tell you both," I said, remaining standing while they settled uncomfortably on my couch. "I learned some interesting things today about your father's estate planning." Elena exchanged a glance with Marcus. "What kind of things?" I pulled out the bank statements Jennifer had given me, documents showing accounts I'd never known existed. "It seems your father left everything to me. The house, the investments, the life insurance policies you thought would be split between the 3 of us. All of it. Every penny." The silence in the room was deafening. "That's impossible," Marcus said finally. "Dad would never—" "Your father knew exactly what he was doing. He also left me a letter explaining why. I didn't show them the letter, but I quoted the parts that mattered. He knew how you really felt about me. He heard the things you said when you thought he wasn't listening." Elena's face went pale. "Mom, we never— don't." The word came out sharper than I'd intended, but I was past caring about their comfort. "Don't lie to me anymore. I know what I've been to you these past months. An obligation, an embarrassment, someone to be managed and tolerated." "That's not fair," Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it? When was the last time either of you called me just to hear my voice? When was the last time you invited me somewhere because you wanted my company, not because you needed my help? When did you start treating me like a stranger in your lives?" Neither of them answered. "I raised you," I continued, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was saying. "From the time you were 12 and 7 years old. I went to every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game. I helped with homework, dried tears, celebrated every achievement. I loved you as completely as any mother could love her children. And we love you too, Elena said quietly. No, you don't. You love the idea of me, the convenient grandmother, the emergency babysitter, the woman who disappears when she's inconvenient and appears when she's needed. But you don't love me. You don't even know who I am. The truth of those words settled over all of us like dust after an explosion. The woman you've been treating like a burden was a respected teacher for 32 years. The woman you've been embarrassed by has a master's degree in education and spent her career helping children discover their potential. The woman you've been trying to manage has been supporting adult literacy programs, mentoring young teachers, contributing to her community in ways you've never bothered to learn about. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. We know you're accomplished, Mom. We've never said otherwise. You've never said anything. When people ask about your family at your fancy dinner parties, do you mention your stepmother, the teacher? Or do you just talk about your successful careers and skip over the woman who helped make them possible? The question hung in the air between us, unanswered because we all knew the truth. Here's what's going to happen, I said, feeling more in control of my own life than I had in years. I'm done trying to fit into the small space you've made for me in your lives. I'm done being grateful for scraps of attention and tolerance. I'm done apologizing for taking up room in the world. What does that mean? Elena asked, and for the first time in months she sounded like she actually wanted to hear my answer. It means I'm living my life for me now. You're welcome to be part of it if you can treat me with the respect and genuine affection that families are supposed to share. But I won't be your convenience grandmother anymore. I won't be your emergency solution anymore. And I definitely won't be your project to manage anymore. I walked to the front door and held it open. I love you both. I always will. But I love myself too. And it's time I started acting like it. They left without arguing, probably too stunned to process what had just happened. As their cars disappeared down my street, I realized something profound. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I was free. For the first time in 5 years, I was exactly where I belonged, in my own life, making my own choices, responsible only to myself and the people who valued what I had to offer. The house felt different around me, not empty, but spacious. Full of possibility, instead of echoing with rejection. I had work to do, gardens to plant, students to teach, friends to entertain. I had a life to live that belonged entirely to me, and I was finally ready to live it. 6 months later, I was in my garden when the letter arrived. Spring had come early that year, and my bulbs were blooming exactly as I'd planned. Waves of purple crocuses giving way to bright yellow daffodils, with tulips waiting their turn in the warming soil. I almost didn't recognize Elena's handwriting on the envelope. It had been 4 months since we'd spoken, 4 months since they'd tested my resolve with carefully crafted messages designed to make me feel guilty for choosing my own peace over their convenience. The letter was 3 pages long, written on Elena's expensive stationery, the kind she used for formal correspondence. Dear Mom, it began. I've been trying to write this letter for weeks, and I keep starting over because nothing I say feels adequate for how wrong we were. Sarah's mother was visiting last month, and during dinner she asked about you. Sarah started explaining why we don't see you much anymore, how you'd become difficult and demanding, and Mrs. Patterson stopped her mid-sentence. You're talking about the woman who raised you? She asked. The teacher who helped pay for Marcus's law school? The one who took care of your father during his illness, and never once complained about the burden? We realized that Sarah had never told her mother the truth about who you were to us, about everything you'd sacrificed to help us become the people we are. In Sarah's version, you were just Dad's wife, someone who'd overstayed her welcome in our lives. Mrs. Patterson looked at us like we were strangers. She said, In my family, we call that woman the backbone of everything good that happened to us. What do you call her? We didn't have an answer, Mom. We couldn't explain why we'd treated the woman who'd loved us unconditionally like an inconvenience to be managed. I've spent weeks thinking about every conversation we've had since Dad died, every time we made you feel small or unwelcome or unnecessary. I remember the Christmas when you brought up Dad's war service, and we acted like you were rambling about ancient history. But those stories weren't rambling. They were our father's legacy. And you were the only one who remembered them with love instead of treating them like embarrassing relics. I remember the birthday party you missed, and how we told David you didn't love him anymore, rather than admitting we'd made you feel so unwelcome that you couldn't bear to be there. I remember every phone call we didn't return, every invitation we didn't extend, every time we chose Sarah's opinion over your feelings. Marcus found the documents Dad left. The lawyer sent them to him after you gave permission. We saw the letter Dad wrote about us, about how worried he was that we'd treat you badly once he was gone. We read his words about how much he loved you, how proud he was of the mother you'd been to us, how devastated he would have been to see how we repaid your devotion. We also learned about the money, Mom. All those times Marcus complained about your modest contributions to family events. He was talking to a woman who was financially independent and choosing to live simply. All those times Sarah made comments about your small house, she was talking to someone who owned that house outright and could have afforded any lifestyle she wanted. You let us treat you badly when you had every resource to walk away from us. You endured our disrespect when you had the power to simply disappear from our lives. Why? And then I realized, because that's what mothers do. They stay. They hope. They love their children even when those children haven't earned it. I called the Literacy Center to ask about your work there. The director, Ms. Williams, talked about you for 20 minutes. She said you're one of their most gifted teachers, that your students request you specifically because you have a gift for making people believe in themselves. She said you've helped 3 people earn their GEDs in just 6 months, that you stay late every week to tutor students who are struggling, that you've donated books and supplies with your own money. Rebecca Morrison is the kind of volunteer we build programs around, she told me. She's remarkable. Remarkable. When was the last time we called you that? When did we stop seeing your remarkable qualities and start focusing only on how your presence affected our convenience? I know we don't deserve forgiveness. I know we squandered something precious through our selfishness and blindness, but I need you to know that we see you now, Mom. Really see you, for the first time since Dad died. We see the teacher who shaped young minds for 3 decades. We see the woman who became a mother overnight to 2 grieving children and loved them as fiercely as if she'd given birth to them. We see the volunteer who's changing lives every week at the Literacy Center. We see the friend who hosts dinner parties that people talk about for weeks afterward. We see the gardener whose yard makes the whole neighborhood more beautiful. We see the woman Dad fell in love with, the one he trusted with his children's futures, the one he knew was strong enough to build a meaningful life with or without us in it. If you're willing, and we understand if you're not, we'd like to try again, not as the people who took you for granted, but as the people you taught us we could be. We want to earn the right to be part of your remarkable life. Marcus is planning to call you next week. He wants to tell you about the scholarship fund he's establishing in Dad's name, one that will help children of single parents attend college. He said he learned from watching you that the greatest gift you can give someone is the education that no one can ever take away from them. I've been volunteering at the women's shelter downtown, helping with their literacy program. It's small compared to what you've been doing, but it's a start. I wanted to understand the work you find so meaningful. We love you, Mom. Not the version of you that fit our convenience, but the real you, the woman who was always too extraordinary for the small space we tried to keep you in. We're ready to love you properly now, if you'll teach us how. All our love, Elena and Marcus. I sat on my porch steps with the letter in my lap, watching my garden bloom in the afternoon sun. A year ago, this letter would have sent me into tears of relief and gratitude. Today, it made me smile with something quieter but more lasting, satisfaction. Not because they were apologizing, but because they were finally seeing clearly. Not because they wanted me back, but because they'd learned to value what they'd almost lost completely. My phone rang that afternoon. Marcus's name on the screen. The first time he'd called in months. Mom? His voice was tentative, uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. I know you got Elena's letter. I was hoping, would you be willing to have dinner with us? Not because we need you to babysit, or because we need something from you, but because we want to hear about your life. We want to know who you are now. I looked out at my garden, thought about my students who would be waiting for me Monday morning, about the book club meeting I was hosting Friday night, about the full, rich life I'd built from the pieces of myself I'd almost forgotten existed. I'd like that, I said. But Marcus? This time we eat at my house. You come into my world, the one I've built for myself, and you come as guests, not as people who have the right to judge or change or manage what you find here. Yes, ma'am, he said, and for the first time in years, his respect felt genuine instead of performed. After I hung up, I sat in my garden as the sun set, surrounded by flowers that had bloomed according to their own schedule, in their own time, exactly as they were meant to. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth. Sometimes stepping back is the most powerful move forward. Sometimes loving someone means refusing to accept less than you deserve, even from the people you love most. I'd learned that dignity wasn't something other people gave you. It was something you claimed for yourself and protected fiercely. I'd learned that being alone was different from being lonely, and that being chosen was different from being convenient. Most importantly, I'd learned that it's never too late to remember who you were meant to be. The woman sitting in this garden, planning tomorrow's lessons and next weekend's dinner party, surrounded by friends who valued her presence and students who needed her gifts. This was who I'd always been underneath the roles I'd played for other people's comfort, and for the first time in years, that was more than enough. It was everything.